The ribs are fully bent, so now I'm ready to begin with the last steps before I can actually start working on the top and the back again, which to me it always kind of feels like it's where the process really begins. I don't really know why I don't feel the same way about the ribs. I feel like it's still more of the preparation phase, which is not true at all because this is part of the instrument. But for some reason I feel it that way. It's like the plates, the top, the back, the roughing out, the arching. It's maybe what makes the instruments, this type of instruments, a bit more special, so that's as well why I feel that way. I don't really know, but still I have a lot to do here because I need to take the ribs to the final height. First I'm going to be working a bit with the plane, and then I also need to cut the corners because they're way too long, as you can see here. This is really long, so I need to do that. After that I also need to prepare and glue the linings. Fortunately I still have some at the right thickness, which means that I don't need to prepare more. I hope there will be enough, I'm not really sure. If not, I should start preparing again for quite a few of them, so I have for my next instrument as well. And so I need to bend the linings, glue them, shape them, and I also need to make the finishing of the ribs, which that way they are smooth, and after that, and only after that, I can draw them on top of the plates and cut. So let's begin, because there's a lot to do. I now need to measure these corners again, and then I need to make them symmetrical if I want them that way. And I work first on all the corners in a way, with a plane at the beginning, then a bit of the files, and finally the scrapers. Now I can start working on the linings. The linings have to be bent, glued and then shaped, but also they fit here on the C-bouts inside the blocks, and this is a very important characteristic on Cremonese instruments throughout history. I mean, among many other things that characterized instruments made in Cremona, the incisions in the linings are one of them. So I will have to make them, and then I will start with the shaping and putting them in place, cutting them so that they're right length and all of that. So I just finished making the channels for the linings. I also had to prepare a few more of the linings because I think I didn't have enough, so just in case I prepared a few more. And made myself some tea, as you can see, some lounging. And as you can see as well, this is a part of the workbench where I have a little bit of mess. I have a lot of documents here with measurements because I've been doing this for I don't know how many years already, and I still cannot remember some basic measurement. I'm quite good at remembering conversations, that's probably the only thing that I'm good at. Names, ages, measurements, I'm terrible at that. I have some headphones so I can be listening to some things while working, so you don't realize that I'm actually not listening to classical music, but if not, that I'm listening to the Backstreet Boys. And I just realized how old I sound like. So when I say something like Backstreet Boys, I'm clearly demonstrating that I'm not as young as I look like. And the worst thing is that I'm trying to think of some other example that it's a little bit more modern than the Backstreet Boys, and the only thing that I can think of is Justin Bieber, but I'm guessing that's also not really modern anymore. So yeah, but in all honesty, of course I like classical music, and when I listen to music, that's what I usually listen to, or some tango as well. Right, so the bending iron is hot. I'm going to start bending the linings, and then once I have them all ready and like fitted properly, I will be gluing them. The good thing is that for the lining, so I can already use the small bending iron, the one that I used for the violin, and of course it's a lot less hot than using the big one for cello. Even though I'm still like using a very high temperature, just the fact that the part that it's heated is smaller makes it that the room gets a lot less hot as well. Okay, so I'm ready to glue. I start with one side and I will do the other one. The process is exactly the same, so I'm going to be here just showing one side. I need to put some plastic or something to protect the ribs when I clamp. Right, so I glued the linings on both sides, and now what I have to do is to take them to the same height as the ribs. It's quite normal to glue the linings a little bit higher than the ribs themselves. And for the parts where the linings are still a little bit lower than the ribs, that is because my ribs, I know that they're still a little bit high, so actually then I'll have to lower everything a little bit. So usually, if the height of the ribs is the final one, then it's quite normal, yeah, to glue the linings a little bit higher than the ribs. In a case like this, where I need to lower everything a little bit, so both the ribs and the linings, I like gluing the linings both either at the same level as the ribs or a tiny bit lower. So now I need to shape the linings here, the inside part, the internal part. So basically the linings have a function of increasing the surface area that then will be glued to the plate, so the top and the back, and also it's going to add some resistance to the ribs. However, I don't want them to be too thick here, because usually when they're thicker here they're not very useful for the increasing contact surface for the gluing, and also when they are thick they get unglued more easily. So then I basically need to repeat this for all the 12 linings, and yeah, it's all the same, so quite repetitive. So I don't think I'm going to be filming much more of this. That way you don't get too bored of this content, only a little bit bored. I'll stop after doing this part, just I started already, so I don't want to stop. So the last steps to finishing the rib structure is to do the finishing of the ribs, although the very last finishing is done later. But now the idea is to try to remove some of the bumps, if there are any, and to scrape it so that it's already smooth. As you can see from this last shot, to do this part I will have to turn it, but to turn it is a little bit difficult with the camera, so I will do that later on. However, the process here is quite, let's say, simple, at least this part, but it's not like the proper final finishing. It's just to scrape it a little bit to make sure that it's smooth. And the most important part is that one that I said at the beginning, which is to remove the bumps that there are, because that is the rib structure, the one that is going to determine the outline of the instrument. So if there are any bumps, I will have bumps on the outline of the top or the back. So usually I tend to get one here where the joints are, so that's exactly what then I will have to actually turn it and work on it properly so that I can see well that there are no more bumps